Thank you, Mara. Hi, everyone. I'm Maya Winkelstein. I'm the Executive Director of Open Road Alliance. We are a philanthropic funder in the space. You can think of us like a family foundation, except we don't have a family and we're not a foundation. But that is the best box to put us in. And as Mara alluded to, our funding strategy is a little different from your typical foundation. We don't have a specific geography that we focus on. We will fund anyone in the world, whether they're international or domestic. And we don't have a particular sector. We will fund anything: health, education, human rights, environment. We have a pretty common sense bar of doing good in the world. Instead, what we only will fund are projects that are mid-implementation, have otherwise been fully funded by another foundation in the space, like Sobrato or someone else, and then something happens. They encounter an unexpected obstacle. Something goes wrong. And all the nonprofits in this room, you know that's a daily occurrence. None of us have ever executed a project where exactly what we put in the proposal is exactly what we did, which is exactly what we got as impact and outcomes at the end. But when these roadblocks occur, the philanthropic system is ill-equipped to deal with that. Right? Now, you guys might encounter a problem and say, well, okay, here's a problem. What's the solution? I've been doing this work for 20 years. I know what the solution is. But just like anyone else in the world, implementing that solution is going to cost a little extra money. It's going to cost another 10%, another 20% on whatever that original project budget or grant budget was. But for a variety of reasons that we're going to get into, can't go back to your original funder and ask them for more. You don't have the money just lying around in nice unrestricted cash reserves. And what we all know happens is that in these moments, what do? You pull out the duct tape, you limp forward. Maybe you only serve 3,000 instead of 4,000 children that school year. Maybe you don't buy computers again, therefore hamstringing your operational ability to grow and expand in the coming year. In short, we get lower impact and lower return on our investment as funders. So Open Road, what we do, at those moments, we provide that extra 25, 50, 100K, allow the project to move forward and keep impact on track. Not surprisingly, as we've been doing this work for over 5 years, and as we've been making these grants in these moments of challenge and roadblock, it became pretty clear to us pretty quickly that there were patterns emerging. Across geographies, across sectors, across organization sizes, nonprofits, social enterprises were encountering the same problems. So we started to do some research and we said, okay, there's something deeper here. What is going on? What we really realized is that a lot of the things that we encounter, even if they could have be prevented, the effects, the negative effects of these events could have been diminished if we had had a conversation up front between the donor and the implementer, and if we had taken some basic risk management steps to try and mitigate these problems in advance. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about some research that Open Road has done over the past 3 years to kind of really analyze what is going on in the sector. But before I get to the numbers, the first thing I really want to talk about is this word risk. What do we mean when we say risk? And when you want to have a conversation about risk, the most important thing to understand is there are 2 types of risk. The whole concept of risk is either subjective or objective. And the word risk by itself doesn't tell us which one we're talking about. So the first type of risk is the subjective side of the coin. It's this idea of risk tolerance, risk appetite. You know, we should be risk-taking. We take risk. That is fundamentally a subjective choice. Think about your own personal financial investments. When you're looking at your 401k or your kid's college fund, do you invest in Tesla or do you invest in bonds? One's high risk, one's low risk. No one can say that one is for certain better than the other. It's simply a reflection of our personal preference. And the same thing goes for foundations. Every foundation has a risk tolerance. Are they risk takers? Are they risk averse? What's interesting is most foundations, while they have a risk tolerance, they haven't actually ever defined it internally or had that discussion. The second side of risk is the objective side. It's the fact that no matter where you fall on the risk scale, whether you're a 1 or a 5 in risk appetite, risk still exists. There's no such thing as a 0 on the risk scale because the world is unpredictable, and no matter what you do and where you do it, uncertainty rules. And so risk management is about this objective reality that stuff happens and that there is a process that we can put in place. There are systems that we can put in place in order to try to mitigate, manage, and reduce the harmful effects of those events or the likelihood that those risk events will occur. So if there's one thing that you take home today as you're from this conversation, whether it's internally or with your funders, is to remember that as soon as you enter into a conversation of risk, ask and remind yourself, what risk am I talking about? Am I in the subjective world of whether we should take this risk, or am I in the objective world of managing real life things that could happen? In this area of risk management on both of these sides, though, there's another category that we need to consider, and that are the types of risk. Right? Even within risk tolerance, you can have different tolerance levels for different types of risk. So think about financial risk, for example, in our sector. How much, if you're a foundation, how much money are you willing to lose? If you're a nonprofit, how much grant money are you willing to risk by putting forward maybe an innovative project or something you know the funder will fund versus something that you think needs to happen but maybe is kind of outside their area? Reputation risk is different. You could be very risk tolerant in terms of your finances, but have very low tolerance in terms of reputation. This is true for a lot of foundations, right? They're willing to risk their dollars, but they don't want to risk their brand. They don't want their brand to be associated with failure or controversy or anything that might make them look bad within their community. Governance risk. This is something that foundations are very good at doing internally in terms of their own board, their own bylaws. It's probably also something that they look at in their nonprofit partners in terms of your boards, your bylaws. Do you have your conflict of interest policies in line? But one area that we don't really look at systematically the same way we do these others is impact risk. What are the things that could go wrong that will actually affect the impact that we are trying to achieve? Not my reputation, not whether I'm going to lose my money, but whether I'm going to get what I'm trying to invest for. And that's the area that we're going to be talking about today, is impact risk. So what do I really mean when I say impact risk? I'm going to give you a couple of examples. These are all real-life examples from Open Road's portfolio. I've got over 100 examples of what literally goes wrong in real life, and we'll be talking about that in our panel today. But just a couple 30-second, sort of 1-minute case studies. PIH Haiti. PIH, fully funded project involving sexual gender-based violence. They were introducing a sexual gender-based violence program into their clinics in Haiti. They got the full grant amount to implement the project. 3 months in, there was a currency devaluation, and all of a sudden they're 30% short on their budget because the Canadian dollar is no longer worth what it was. AEO USA, this is an organization that works on providing access to credit to businesses with people of color, minority, veteran communities. They were introducing a really big multi-million dollar fund. They had an anchor investor in Texas, an individual donor who was leading the investment round. They had lined everybody up, but for those of you familiar with these types of fundraising investments, the anchor, of course, has to put in their money first before everyone else will. And unfortunately, the gentleman leading this round had a heart attack and died before he could sign the paperwork. Mano a Mano in Bolivia, a literal roadblock, fully funded to build a road. This is an organization, 20 years of experience building infrastructure in rural Bolivia. They were constructing a road, a 40-kilometer road that would connect a rural community to the local market, thereby creating all kinds of economic opportunity. And their road was literally washed out in the middle of construction during the dry season in a flood that hadn't happened for 100 years. And Isidore E-Recycling in Los Angeles, this is an e-recycling business that, in addition to their environmental e-recycling mission, also employ only formerly incarcerated individuals to help them re-enter into society. And while they were going through their annual business registration with the County of Los Angeles, the person processing their application miscategorized them in the junk business, which automatically increased their insurance bill 5-fold overnight. It was an error on the part of the county. They eventually resolved it, but it took 9 months. And meanwhile, they had to keep operating, and they couldn't operate without insurance. So these are the types of things that we're talking about in impact risk, things that happen that derail the project. So how often does this happen, though? Are these just like the crazy things that you hear stories about, or is this a more common occurrence? Well, we've done the research. We surveyed 200 foundations and 200 nonprofits, and we found that the frequency with which a risk event occurs is 1 in 5. 1 out of 5 projects encounter a roadblock which requires additional funding in order to reach impact as originally planned. If you're a funder, 20% of your portfolio is at risk. Think about that in dollar terms. If you're a $100 million a year foundation, that's $20 million that right off the bat is subjective to lower or zero ROI if you're not managing for this. So we know it happens, and we ask foundations, do this happen? They know it happens. But what we found is even though we know it happens, we're not really doing much about it. So we also asked funders in this survey things like, at any point in the application process, in written or verbal form, do you ask what could go wrong? 76% of foundations we talked to said they do not ask at any point in their application process what could go wrong. It just doesn't cross their mind. This concept of risk is not a ubiquitous part of our grant-making philosophy today. And it won't surprise the nonprofits in the room that when funders don't ask, nonprofits don't tell. Moreover, foundations, even though they know this happens, 83% of foundations have no budget for contingencies internally. So even if their nonprofit does come back to them and say, hey, I have a problem, the program officer says, oh my gosh, that's awful, I'd love to help, but I'm out of money. Which I always find is an interesting thing to hear from a foundation that has an endowment of, however many millions or billions, but we don't have the $50,000 to solve this problem. And by the way, underwrite our own $500,000 investment, which we have already made. And 65 of foundations don't even have a policy to deal with these requests, to deal with off-cycle requests or emergency requests for these contingency funds when risk does realize. So that's the funder side. But as Mara pointed out, this is a shared responsibility. Risk is a shared responsibility between funders and nonprofits. We both reap the benefits and the consequences of not dealing with this problem. So what are the nonprofits doing? Well, even though 1/5 of all of your grants and projects across the board are encountering a problem, over half of you have never even asked a funder for additional funding, never even told them when something's going wrong. And as much as when funders don't ask, grantees don't tell, funders can't help with problems they don't know exist. There's also a disconnect between what funders think nonprofits can do in the face of obstacles and what nonprofits can actually do. We asked funders, okay, when someone does come to you with one of these requests, if you don't fund them, what do you think happens? And 65% of funders said, well, if we don't fund them, they'll find the money somewhere else. Realistically, that only happens 35% of the time. And actually, the most common place that nonprofits will pull this money if they can't get it from their original funder is from their own internal budgets, which, as we all know, just really is stealing from Peter to pay Paul somewhere else in our larger programs. And on this policy front, this systematic front, it's just as bad for nonprofits. 46% don't have any type of risk management policy. That includes even informal risk management policies like, hey guys, let's schedule a lessons learned call, or let's schedule a debrief call, let alone any sort of systematic management where you're writing down, recording, analyze, tracking risks and what actually happens. So that's the state of the sector. I shared some examples of what can go wrong. Another piece of research which we've actually just completed and is going to be published next week, so stay tuned for that, is we went through our entire portfolio over the past 5 years and looked at exactly what went wrong. And this is across geographies, across sectors, across organization size. And what we've coded for were 22 different types of roadblocks, things like fraud, theft, et cetera. And we said, okay, what goes wrong and how often? And this is what we found. These are the 3 broad types of categories of things that go wrong: organization misfortune, acts of God, funder created. And to save you the trouble of adding that up, 46% of everything that has ever come through our door asking for help has been a problem that is at least funder related, if not created. And you can see what those are: delay of disbursement, change in strategy, funder misfortune. So an example of that would be, let's say it's a foundation that is a corporate foundation tied to an oil company in Canada. When the oil prices plummeted, the foundation no longer had any money to meet their grant commitments. So what does this data tell us? Well, it tells us a couple things. First, the world is unpredictable, and the social sector is not immune to that. We might all have good intentions, we might be doing good work, but if you really think about it, by definition, we're actually working in the riskiest places with the most risky populations in the world, right? That's why we're doing this, and it's not being solved by the market. Everyone's heard, right? Philanthropy's risk capital. We take the risks that government and private sector can't take. So it should follow that we actually expect our work to be more unpredictable. But as we've seen, that's not the reality. Number 2, the world is unpredictable and we're unprepared. We don't have the budget, we don't have the policy, we don't have the procedures in place to deal with this, even if we accept and internalize this idea of inherent uncertainty in our work. 3, policies, procedures, and papers are one thing, but we all know at the end of the day, communication matters, right? Don't ask, don't tell, don't solve the problem. Communication and this conversation between funders and nonprofits is a really root cause of some of these challenges. 4, impact suffers. This isn't about getting the grant or not. This isn't about having some kind of incremental better relationship with your funder. This is about real things. When we asked, if you don't solve these problems, what happens to the project? Over 80% of the time, impact is compromised. It means either the scale is reduced, right? We helped 3,000 instead of 4,000 kids. The timeline is extended, which time is money, money is impact. And in 16% of the case, the project was terminated completely. 0 ROI, 0 impact, a lot of time and money down the drain. And this last one, which is a result of our latest thing, which is actually good news, is that we're our own worst enemy. The most frequent challenge is the one that is caused by our own conversations or lack thereof between funders and nonprofits, and opposed to acts of God or organization misfortune and those other categories that you saw up there. The funder created, the funder related, the nonprofit funder relationship, that's something we can actually change. So right there, we have the potential to eliminate 46% of everything we see, just if we can work on our relationship together. So that's the problem, but don't worry, we are going to talk about the solution. And to bring a little more color to this now, I'll invite my colleagues back up to hear some more. Mm-hmm.
So
That is a great question. The short answer is yes-ish. And I'll show you a couple examples or at least a pathway to get there after the panel.
Great. Well, can you all hear me? Yes? We have on our stage, we have Ari Johnson of Muso and Tony MacDonald of Samasource with us here today to have this conversation about risk in real life and nonprofit organizations. And you have their bios that came out in the material, but Ari is the CEO, Tony is the CFO. So from that dual perspective of impact and finance, trying to get the mix and the types of conversations and perspectives that we have on risk management in the nonprofit sector and in philanthropy. But I want to start and just let you all give a little bit of background about your organization and your role within it. And how does this resonate for you? Why did you agree to come up and speak about this topic? I could start with you, Ari.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here with all of you. So at Muso, we exist because we believe no one should die waiting for healthcare. We work in West Africa, and what we do is we partner with communities to design, build, and test proactive universal healthcare systems that are designed to save lives by reaching every patient early. Now, we're working on building solutions to the global child mortality crisis, which is a crisis that last year killed more than 5 million children. This is a very intractable injustice in our world. And so we are working in areas of really extreme poverty, some of the harshest conditions and climates in the world. And so we are thinking about risk all of the time. We're trying to do something, build solutions to the global child mortality crisis that many people would consider impossible or unfeasible. And so necessary to the work is actually being rather audacious, trying to do things that are inherently very risky. And so we are facing every day big risks in our work. And so we have had to take a very risk-forward perspective in our work. It's been important to us to build an organization that is very resilient to risks as they come and very proactive in finding the risks and communicating about the risks and preparing for them.
Great, thank you. And Tony.
So I'm the CFO of Samasource, and Samasource is quite a bit different than Muso. We were founded with the notion of creating opportunity for all in training and employment, particularly. And the notion that our founder Lila Jana, was that we have a world where opportunity is not equally distributed, and in parallel, a bit of a sense of frustration with traditional development aid. And the notion that Lila came up with was that we're now executing is that we should be able to, through the digital economy, to provide work to those. We work particularly in East Africa through the computer to provide jobs for people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. So those that are earning around under $2 a day. And we've developed a program where we offer training in the slums of Nairobi and in northern Uganda, in the former war-torn region of northern Uganda, where we train young people that have never had any kind of formal employment, and we train them in the communities that they reside, particularly in the slum regions or in the villages. And we identify and provide them the skills and the tools to be able to provide work. And then we broker contracts primarily with Silicon Valley companies for very basic digital data projects. And we broker the work and manage those workforces to provide them with the employment opportunities. Our goal is twofold: to provide the direct impact to these communities so that we provide accountable distribution of funds, skill development, long-term career prospects for individuals that can then feed back into the communities and create a sustainable pattern of improvement. But we're also trying to serve as a model for the greater world on how responsible and ethical business practices doesn't conflict with the typical for-profit objectives. We're a 501c3, we're a social enterprise, and we have a very strong model built on a commercial basis. But our ultimate goal is to create impact, and we measure it. Just like we measure the dollars, we measure the impact and the outcomes of how every individual that we put through our program is transformed, and we do it over longitudinal, long time basis. Now, I'm the CFO. By definition, I'm paid to think about risk constantly. And cases that may be a little bit different than Ari as the CEO, I always try to restrain the optimism and quantify and try to get objective about what we see as a realistic or potential risk, and make sure that we have a strategy and a thought process for how we deal with it. And so for me, thinking about risk and discussing it is instrumental to what we are able to do to be successful, and particularly in my role. I will also say my background has, prior to me working at Samasource, was all in the for-profit software space, primarily, where I learned how that world, that ecosystem manages risk. And all my framework of thinking about risk is imported from that experience on the for-profit cycle. So when I'm talking to everybody today about these notions, I am leveraging what I've seen as the best practices in the real commercial for-profit world.
Great. So building on that, and I think this is something that's top of mind for me, being in sort of the hub and innovation capital of the world, where risk is celebrated a little bit, that it's seen as necessary to take risk, to understand risk, and to have plans for it in order for businesses to succeed. Just wondering from each of your perspectives, what's different about our sector that turns a blind eye, especially here, where maybe we're not learning from the environment and the culture of the tech sector and the for-profit sector here? What do you think is holding us back from learning at least that one piece?
It's a great question. And I think that you're absolutely right. We, as a sector, philanthropic and on the nonprofit side, we've adopted overall what I've seen is a posture that's extremely risk averse, and also extremely lax on the measurement piece of this, measuring and detecting what's working and what doesn't. And those two things are related, right? Because if we actually want to solve the greatest injustices on our planet, we're going to need to be ready to take risks. We're going to need to be ready to actually do things that have some risk that some things aren't going to work out, right? And we're going to need to be able to hold ourselves accountable, to put in place rigorous measurement, to figure out what's working and what isn't working, and then communicate that, and then learn from that, and then change based on that. And none of the incentive structures right now are really set up predominantly to support either of those things from happening. Mm-hmm. And so we need a real big shift if we're actually going to solve the biggest problems around us.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Thank you. Tony and Maya, do you guys have another perspective on this?
It's interesting because I've been thinking a lot about the conversation that we had previous to this, and why there's a difference in the way that we think. And I think I'm anchored to the word that Ari used, which is accountable. And I think one of the largest differences between the philanthropic sector and what we call as the risk-taking capitalistic sector of the communities that exist here is the measurement of how we understand those outcomes. And to put a really sharp point on it, imagine a world in which funders and their livelihood and their jobs were completely tied to the successful outcomes that were projected on an impact basis. in the plans and the grant proposals that were put forward, rather than just the goals of the amount of funding that needed to be, or the perception or the positive public relations and the credibility and the way that we can succeed. But if we tied it to hard numbers to say our success rate relative to project proposal impact outcomes and actual outcomes, if we were held to an accountability like the VC world was, there'd be a radical transformation in how we assess the risk. We would, to Maya's point, we would evaluate our subjective tolerance the funders would very quickly to understand what is it we're willing to go out and risk. And separately, on the objective side, there would be a lot more aggressive involvement to help manage the execution risk or the objective risk. And in the VC world, in the communities that we live in here, that system is ingrained in the process, and they've got it down to a science. And a lot of times they will say this is too risky for us, and or this is not within our specialization of being able to assist in managing the objective risk. But they all know that out of 10 investments, one's going to fail. They know what the expectation on that one success is going to be.
Yeah, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said, and I think that just offer two additional points to think about why, like, how did we get here? One is a number I love to quote. Some of you might be familiar with the Grant Makers for Effective Organizations, GEO. They do a annual sort of state of the sector survey of foundations. And one of their results I love to quote is they surveyed foundations and said that 84% of foundations said that they wanted to invest in innovation. But when they asked the question, are you willing to invest in an unproven or untested project or model, only 46% were willing to do that. So there is a cognitive dissonance that exists there. And as we've been reflecting on it, there's a greater, that cognitive dissonance for me actually comes out of the history of philanthropy and where we are today versus where we were 20 years ago versus what the origins of philanthropy were 100 or 150 years ago. If you go back 150 years ago to the origins of philanthropy, which certainly in America and Europe and the Judeo-Christian tradition was in the church, right? It was original philanthropy, alms for the poor. Why did you give alms to the poor? It had nothing to do with alleviating poverty. Giving alms to the poor was about the giver. It was to show that you were a good Christian and that therefore you were worthy of heaven. Fast forward to today. Why do foundations and most donors give away their money? Yes, there's probably still some ego, still some of this charity model, I want to feel good, but most philanthropists today actually generally want to see change in the world, and they're using their dollars as a vehicle to get that return. So we have shifted from a charity model of philanthropy to an investment model of philanthropy. But it's happened gradually, and we haven't really let that sink in. But as soon as you start thinking about your philanthropy as investments, and therefore can apply the same strategies and ideas that you have from an investment standpoint, a lot of this becomes obvious, right? What's an investment? Risk and return, 101. We're dealing with return. We're trying to figure out how to measure impact now. 20 years ago, if you had said impact metrics, no one would know what you were talking about. So this whole investment concept is still relatively new, and we are figuring it out. We're getting somewhere on the return side in terms of how do we measure impact, how do we evaluate. Risk is still being left behind. The good news is it's not rocket science. We can do it, and we do have good examples from the private sector of things that we can pull over so we don't have to recreate the wheel.
Great, thank you. I just want to get your thoughts on who bears this responsibility. How do we change this dialogue? How do we go from knowing to doing the best way to deal with this? What's to start?
As a nonprofit grantee, I'd want to take some accountability to it, but I also feel that it may not be equally the accountability may not be equally dispersed in the sense that, we talk a bit about it, but if grantors don't ask and they don't communicate, the grantees don't think that's the system or the way it works. And so I think there's joint accountability to raise and escalate the conversation and to be objective and factual about the situation that we're in, which I think this is the perfect start to that conversation. But I also feel like the funders, they need to pivot a bit to look at their accountability relative to outcomes and prompt those conversations. They're the ones that are the locus of how the funding takes place, about which programs get funded and succeed and go forward. I think they bear slightly more responsibility of shifting the sector or moving the way that we need to behave. It's shared, but I have a bias there.
Yeah, I think the responsibility is shared. Neither side, funders or nonprofits, can achieve their objectives without the other. You got to meet each other in the middle. It is a 50-50 accountability. And we all know, and you cannot be denied, there's a power dynamic. Funders have the power. They have the money. So from that sort of more practical, realist lens, I personally believe that the first step really can and should be taken by funders. And again, we can think about the monitoring and evaluation framework as a good analogy to this. Right? Nonprofits may have been measuring their impact or trying to measure their impact or know they should do it, but nothing will get you up and running with an M&E program like a funder who requires it to receive their check. I have a suspicion that the same will be true with risk assessments or risk management policies. If funders start asking for these, if they start requiring these, it will push the needle. Now there's a catch there, right? It does have to be right-sized. If you're giving $10,000 to a $3 million nonprofit and asking for a 6-page risk assessment, it's probably not right-sized. So just like in M&E, we have learned the hard way that not every project needs an RCT and a 20-page log frame with 26 quantitative indicators. Again, hopefully we can learn from that and maybe skip over that and get straight to the right sizing for the risk side.
Great.
Yeah, just to build off of that, I think this piece about measurement is really key, because at the end of the day, yes, it's all of our responsibility, because we all must hold ourselves accountable to the people we serve, to our patients, right? And they should be our real bosses here. And an issue is one of the most important ways to do that is to actually measure in a way that will be as likely to pull out the things that aren't working, the risks and the dangers and the failures, as it is to pull out the things that are working. And we are in a space where the incentives are so strongly skewed for us to measure in a way that just produces success stories, right? And it's enormously dangerous. It's particularly dangerous to our patients and to the people we serve, to our mission. It's basically like driving blind with all the people we serve in the back seat. We're not really seeing where we're going. We don't even know what the risks are if we don't actually invest the resources in looking for them. And so I think it's even beyond having a demand for including M&E or research embedded in the work that you do. It's actually having the expectation that be the right kind of measurement, monitoring, evaluation, and research, that having the expectation and the incentives aligned between the funders and the implementers, that we are going to measure rigorously, we are going to uncover, and we need to uncover both things that are working and things that are not working, and then we should be held accountable to how effectively as implementers we are at surfacing the things that aren't working and fixing them and improving our performance.
Great. So I'm sensing a theme about the risk management really tied to impact evaluation, and it sounds like we did one before the other. We invested a lot in impact and evaluation, and that's a key term, but without really thinking on the front end about risk management, what could go wrong, and really making sure that impact and learning was uncovering what could go wrong, what is going wrong, so that you can be reflective and learn from it and improve and course correct. That both of those things are sort of flip side of the same coin. So I know Maya shared with us 1-minute case studies. I was wondering if each of you could give just an example of what this looked like for your organization, where something didn't go according to plan, how you dealt with it, and maybe, if you do have a shining light of how a funder maybe helped you proceed through it, if you can share that as well.
Absolutely. You want to go first, Ben?
Well, I can bring up the example that led us to being introduced and working with Open Road. Our model was originally based, and still components of it, on having local work centers. So we have very basic work centers that are managed by partners through East Africa and also in India. And we discovered that model, it didn't do a good enough job in the balance of impact, meaning we screen people based on their need, and at the same time we need productivity because the work that we're doing are for the Silicon Valley companies. And we found that the partners struggled with balancing those competing priorities. We learned that if we managed our own center directly, it would be more efficient and effective, and we could deepen the impact because we could understand the populations more directly and how to react to them. And so we opened, with some funding, we opened a small center in Nairobi, and we discovered very quickly that this was something that had more opportunity relative to the fact that the impact was far deeper, the way that we could manage it, and the quality of the output that we were selling was improving drastically. So the work environment, everything was better. But we were financially strapped, and we could see that we were losing the contracts that were funding our organization and our mission with our partners. It was declining at a rate that was exceeding what we could build up ourselves. And it was very much an inflection point for our organization, where it was a risk that we had never anticipated. We assumed that the partner model would continue, but the degree to which the change was happening was beyond our expectations, and we simply had a funding gap. And our existing funders, all the same reasons that we talked about, we were not in the funding cycle. The contingency mechanism was not fast enough to deal with it, a number of these reasons. And we ended up working with Open Road, receiving the funding that literally got us through this period of inflection in the model, and we're now 3 times larger, 3 times more constituents. And it really came down to literally months of weeks of having an ability to pivot from that. Now, that was that was an environmental change. We did not expect it. It was one of the, we could have built contingency relative to that, but it was a degree of change that we had not anticipated. And it was fundamental to the way that we thought about what we were working on. And so that was an example of, it was environmental. There was a change in the way that Silicon Valley companies were demanding our work. We realized that we were losing on the traditional model, and we hadn't foreseen it. And it happens to everybody. But we were able to pivot and survive and flourish, frankly, because we received that catch and that backstop relative to that risk assessment. So it was, it stands still now as one of those moments in our organization's history that we would have been out of existence in a very quick amount of time.
Wow.
So,
an example that I can share from Muso. About this time last year, Muso launched a large expansion into a new region of remote rural area in Mali. And when we did, this area has one of the lowest rates of access to care in the world, and something happened that we did not expect, which is utilization of care, healthcare visits increased almost immediately tenfold So within weeks, we were seeing a 10x increase. We expected things to improve, but not that much and not that fast. And so we were stuck actually in a rather dire situation because of this. If you think about it, we were stuck with this terrible choice in front of us between the organization being in financial peril and our mission for all the patients who are counting on us in turn, and our patients also being in mortal peril, their lives on the line, coming to seek care at this critical moment right after our launch. And are we going to deliver? And so the fact that we could engage a partner like the Open Road Alliance to both provide technical support helping us think through the risk and financial support at that critical moment. Also to encourage us to communicate proactively with our other funders.
Yeah.
That process, we're scared about that. It's a scary thing to reach out to funders and tell them about something like this going wrong, and the responses were varied. We had funders who came to us and said, you need to build out a plan to shut down the organization and be ready to activate those contingencies, furlough staff, et cetera, within a matter of weeks. So we got varied responses, but far more than we expected. We got responses from partners who said, wow, thank you so much for engaging us about this. And they realized that they had skills that they could offer to help us think through how to manage this crisis. They became more engaged as partners, and both through technical and financial support, they stepped in more. So through that combination of different support, we were able to come out of the situation and to catalyze a sea change in access to care, come out of the acute crisis, and in the process to build in more resilient structures, strengthen our finance team, change our cash on hand policy together with the board that's benchmarked at a level that's more appropriate to the risk of the organization. So those things combined, we learned a lot from that experience.
Great, thank you. I think that's a good segue, Maya, into your quick presentation on some potential solutions, because those are great examples of how we can do this better.
Yes. Wonderful. And so, all right. So we know there's a problem, right? We know it's a real problem. We know it's affecting real people's lives, and not to mention our own organization's effectiveness and sustainability. But what can we do about it? So solutions. This toolkit, there's hard copies available in the back. This is also available on our website, free to download. As we started getting into the research that I presented earlier and getting a sense of the scope of the problem, two things became clear to us that I mentioned before. One, this is systemic. It's a big issue, bigger than we thought. Two, there's something we can do about it. This is good news. It's solvable. So in 2016, over the course of 6 months, we brought together over 20 folks, both from foundations, nonprofits, as well as other actors in the philanthropic space. People like tax advisors, lawyers, intermediaries like Arabella Advisors, to convene this group to say, all right, here's the problem, what's the solution? What can we do about this? And over the course of that 6 months, this is what we came up with. It is a toolkit for risk management. What it is meant to be used. It is primarily designed for funder use. The document in front of you, you'll see in the language and everything, is very geared towards what funders can do. That was a deliberate choice on the task force part, again, reflecting the power dynamic. And the first step, can come from funders. However, if you read this, if you look at the document in general, there's a lot of things in here that are directly transferable to nonprofits and steps that nonprofits can also take for their own internal risk management. It is meant to be used. There's 10 tools in there. You can use them a la carte. You can use them all together. And it is divided down into 2 sections. That risk culture section, so how to define your risk appetite, how to define your risk tolerance, how to write a risk profile statement, and risk management. Okay, you've defined your tolerance. Now what do you do with the fact that the world is unpredictable? And what are some policies and procedures that you can put in place internally to try and mitigate and manage for that. This is just the table of contents to give you a sense. So the first 3 tools are risk culture, and the last 7 are all around risk management. I'm just going to talk about the bookends, number 1 and number 10, just to give a couple ideas of what's in there, and then I hope everyone will have some fun bedtime reading later this evening. All right, so risk tolerance, we talked about this before, but to put it in just, again, into practical terms, when we say what is your risk tolerance, this is what we're asking, right? On a scale of 1 to 5, where do you fall? And again, if any of you have ever had a conversation with a 401k broker or your 529 college savings plan broker or anyone, the first question they ask you is this: where do you sit? And they ask you that because they can't begin to recommend the right mutual fund or the right stock or the right set of investments if they don't know this. So now think about our work. As funders, how can we even begin to consider which applications are right for us if we don't know where we fall on this line? And when I'm speaking to groups of primarily funders, I'll actually start with an exercise where I'll say, okay, write down your own personal risk tolerance for your own investments. Now, write down what your foundation is. And most people in the room can't do it. And if they can do it, I say, okay, you wrote it down. Now, would every other staff member at your organization write the same number? Probably not. So we got to get clear on this. And for nonprofits, by the way, this is important for us too. Would your board have the same number as your staff in your nonprofit? And what about across that taxonomy of financial, governance, reputation, impact? You have a 1 in one area and a 5 in another. How do you reconcile that? So how do we answer this question? Well, talk. Starts with a conversation internally. You can do this as a foundation, you can do this as a nonprofit. The toolkit has a whole discussion guide on how to facilitate this conversation among staff or board. And here's just a couple of examples of what it is, right? So again, what are we more concerned about losing? Are we more concerned about losing money, losing face, losing impact? We can't have it all. There's going to have to be trade-offs. So where are they? What's an acceptable failure rate? Not, do we accept failure? What is an acceptable failure rate? And if your answer is 0, get out of the business. Once we come up with if we pick that number of what we want to be, we can also go through an exercise of, okay, well, does our grant portfolio over the last 3 years or our project history, you know, the types of grants we've applied for, does it reflect what we want to be? You know, if you say, I'm a risk taker, and you're only investing in tried and true projects, how true is that? And again, making sure that this conversation ultimately, it's got to start somewhere. We find it usually is helpful to start at the board level and kind of get that buy-in first. But it does something that is useful to permeate your organizations. Because again, if your board says we want to be risk-taking, but your program staff doesn't feel that, you're not going to get what you're looking for on the ground, or vice versa. So that's the risk tolerance side. Jumping to the end on the risk management side. The risk management cycle. This is the first place to start for coming up with a risk management policy or procedure. It's intuitive. It also, if there are folks in the room who focus a lot on M&E, might look a little familiar in terms of a monitoring and evaluation cycle. Right? If you can't read it, first step, identify your risks. Literally, this can just be getting your team together and saying, all right, guys, we're kicking off the project tomorrow. What do we think could go wrong? And whiteboard it out, and you come up with 50 things. And then you say, okay, now let's prioritize these 50 things. Sort it into a really easy framework is what is likely and what is likely to, and what will have the most harmful consequences. So, aliens invading would have a really harmful consequence on probably all of our projects, but it's not likely to happen. So we don't really need to worry about that. Similarly, someone stealing your lunch from the break room fridge, that's going to happen. but it's not really going to affect our project. So we don't need to deal about that. The things we want to focus on then in terms of mitigating risk are the things that are likely to happen and likely to have a significant harmful consequence. So you take that list and you cut it down to about 10. And then out of that 10, you say, okay, well, these 7 are things we can mitigate. Okay, we're working with a new local partner. We're not exactly sure about their financial capacity. We anticipate that fraud or theft or just general mismanagement, even without malintentions, is a possibility. Well, guess what? You can give them a financial training course before you start the project. That would be a way to mitigate it. For nonprofits, if you do this, it also gives you the tools to talk to your funders about it. You now can talk to your funders about this. If you just identify risks and stop, you get into that whole issue of, oh my gosh, yeah, please give me money, but by the way, here's all the things that could go wrong. You can't stop there. Here's the risks, and here's the plan we've already developed to address them. Here's the ones we can address, and if you really care about this, here's where you can help us out in these mitigation tactics. It will also give the funder then that sense of what's going on. To the competition environment in terms of, well, gosh, why should I do this if my neighbor next door applying for the same grant isn't doing it? I'm just going to look bad and their project is going to look so much better. To that, I say trust your funders. They're smart people. They are investors. And just like any of you, if anybody ever came up to you and said, invest in this, nothing could ever go wrong. I pull them out of the pile right away. And we have this conversation. We ask this of our own grantees. What else could happen? We're solving this problem for you, but what's the next thing that could go wrong? We've had applicants say, this is it. This is the only thing. Like, really? I wouldn't fund them. So identify, mitigate, and then contingency plan, right? There are some things we just cannot foresee. And that's where cash reserves come in. That's where these procedures and policies for emergency, either emergency funding requests come in. It's also communication, right? So if you have that conversation with your funder and you're saying, all right, here are the risks we see, here are the ones we can address, and here are the ones that we can see, even maybe you can see them coming, but we can't do anything about it. Like elections. If it goes this way, we know that's going to have an impact, but we're not going to be able to affect it. So can we put a contingency plan in place if that happens? Or if aliens do invade, can we come back to you? And you don't need to have a number. I mean, you can talk to your funder about, can we have a 10% contingency budget? Based on the riskiness of this project, we'd like you to set aside an additional $25,000. If we need it, we'll come back to you. You can do that if you have a good relationship and you can get there, let me know. I would love to write a case study about it. But at the very least, it can, again, just be about communication. Hey, by the way, and you can do this after you get the grant. Thank you so much for the grant. By the way, who do I call if something goes wrong? If something's not working out, if I see a risk arise that we haven't already discussed, who do I contact? Even that will get the conversation started. And then lastly, monitor, right? Risks are dynamic, they change, things get better, things get worse. And so in an ideal world, you have this cycle. And as Ari really mentioned, the great thing about risk management is that even if it's just in a very simple way, as long as it is consistent and systematic, risk management, preventing bad things from happening or managing bad things, all of a sudden turns into learning and improvement, continuous learning and improvement. You know what happened last time, you figured out how to avoid it, it won't happen the next time. And as we mentioned before, at the crux of this, aside from budget policies and grant-making policies and application policies, communication really is the crux here. So what are some things that we can do to sort of build these effective funder-grantee relationships? I'm going to focus on the nonprofit list here just because that's mostly who we have in the room. Lead by example, right? If your funder isn't asking for a risk assessment, try offering one. See what happens. Be brave. And ask your funders. If they're not asking you the question, you can ask them the question. By the way, what is your risk tolerance? hey funder, what risks are you willing to take and which risks wouldn't you be willing to take? Pick up the phone. My mother loves to remind me, phones work both ways, dear. Again, funders can't help with problems they don't know exist. The fourth one is it's easy, really easy to funder bash, right? Like they're the ones with the power, they got the money, they're not being nice, they're not giving us unrestricted, they're not. We all have a boss, and that's true for funders too. And I think one thing that will help in this, reflects on the funder side, being empathetic with their nonprofits is, I think it can be really useful for nonprofits to understand funder constraints. Right? So we get all the time in our portfolio program officers from foundations with endowments over $1 billion large, asking me to come in and help one of their grantees with a $50,000 or $90,000 bridge grant. It's not because they don't believe in the project. It's not because they don't want to help. It's because they're hamstrung internally. They don't have the procedure to get the money out the door. They don't have the budget authority to make that $90,000 grant on the $1 million grant that is coming to keep payroll going for the 3 months between the grant cycles. They just don't. So understanding the constraints that your funders are under and being empathetic with them as much as we want them to be empathetic with our cash flows and our constraints as nonprofits. And take unilateral actions where you can. If you have not had a conversation about cash reserves in your nonprofit, please start that conversation. Creating cash reserves is hard. It's a lot easier said than done. But you at least need to talk about where you want to be and where you should be for your organization. And as Ari pointed out, if what your current rubric should change. And work towards it. Think about this in your own life, right? I mean, how many of us are working on poverty alleviation, income inequality, and what is the one thing we work with low-income communities all the time? Savings, 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 savings. An innovative way to create savings, because we know that the working poor in this country and that individuals living in poverty around the world are one catastrophe away from falling back below the poverty line, from absolute disaster. Well, nonprofits, we are the working poor of the business world, right? Let's practice what we preach. Let's find those ways to build those cash reserves where we can. That takes us to our exercise.
So everybody there are envelopes scattered throughout in front of the tables, and we want you to get into groups of about 6. And half of the examples are you are a nonprofit dealing with some of these issues in the real world. Some of them are from the funder perspective. And what is really useful about this exercise is chances are you might be in a role reversal. So go ahead and turn, row 2, you can turn around, face row 3, and vice versa, and just huddle up in groups of 6 or so. And if you don't have an envelope right in front of you, there are ones scattered, and we can come by. And we'll come around and facilitate as well. And we'd love to get a little bit of sharing out, maybe from 1 or 2 groups. It's always good when you can't collect people from the exercise. It means that the conversations were good. But I'd love just maybe 1 or 2 volunteering some key takeaways from your discussion. And we have my colleague Raina over here with a mic, and Olena over on this side with a mic. So anybody who'd like to do a quick share out, maybe 1 or 2. All right, right here. Elena's coming your way.
And just before you start, can you just specify whether you were a nonprofit or a funder?
We were all nonprofit.
Yeah, just in the scenario.
Yes, the scenario was a nonprofit as well. We were tasked with building 2 parks and raising money from 3 funders to do so, and one of the funders asked us for a risk management plan. So we thought of a few ideas that could likely happen if we didn't get all the funds. What would we do? We talked about scaling back, potentially not providing services ourselves, but turning into a location and reaching out to other community-based organizations to offer skill programming. We also talked about the idea that the community itself rejects the idea of having a park for noise complaints or any other things. So we thought the best solution would be do some research, see if that increases property value, see if that lowers the risk of or increases safety, any sort of education we can do, including going to the Parks and Recs department and see what they have available. Talking about natural or legal barriers. So we decided that it would be smart to have a third backup site in case one of the 2 sites for any reason isn't allowed to actually be turned into a park. And then finally, environmental concerns. So we would just have to walk through those kind of things and make sure that we have a plan in place to address any environmental concerns that would be specific to the area.
Great, thank you. Do we have an example maybe from a funder? A group that had played the funder role who wants to share out? Quiet group. Oh. Ooh. Perfect. Raina has the mic. Great.
Okay, so I might volunteer some of my colleagues in our group to also contribute. We were the funder for this park proposal, and we thought, well, maybe we're new to the park funding scene, and so we would want some more information about this process, and in particular, I think the big thing that we had identified as being really risky was getting the city approval to convert the lots into playgrounds, and thinking about, in particular, what if that timeline doubles? Or what if the people that you think you know in the city to help you turn over? Or those people don't like each other? Or, all those kinds of things that can happen. Does someone else want to add something else? The end.
Thank you so much. It's always, sometimes it gives you a real life, especially when you're switching roles, sort of what the considerations have to be. So with that, I'm mindful of time, but I do want to give a chance for Q&A, knowing that I know I'll be here, Maya will be here for a little bit to answer questions as well, but would love to open up the room for any questions that you all have about what you heard. Kathleen, the mic is coming, so Raina will go. Yeah. So again, Raina and Elena will be there, and if we could wait for the mics just to make sure everybody can hear.
So one thought I had too is if you're small nonprofit and you've hired people from a big nonprofit, they may not understand the risks of a small nonprofit. So have you looked at ways of analyzing the right staff to work in the risk levels of a foundation? And you could even say the same thing about a board. You shouldn't be getting people that come out of a huge company to be on a small profits board. Have you looked at profiling people for it?
Our research hasn't looked at staff profiles. We have in that What Goes Wrong research coded for the organization size. So our portfolio includes nonprofits and social enterprises with annual budgets under $1 million a year and with annual budgets over $100 million a year. So the world is unpredictable. That applies no matter how big you get or how small you get. And in that sense, it's equal across the board in terms of risk, right? So a government approval not coming through would be just as devastating to a large organization's project as a small organization's project. So in that case, it's actually the same. I think where it differs, and to your point, is on the mitigation side of saying, okay, well, given the resources within my organization, what can we do to mitigate? And certainly an organization, with I'm not going to say larger budget, but I'm going to specifically say larger amount of unrestricted assets, percentage-wise, will be in a better position to create a cash reserves than an organization that 95% of all of their funding is restricted. So that would be a difference I would look at. In terms of who on staff, just thinking about it, the thing about risk management, kind of like in an ideal monitoring and evaluation, there's a role to play for everyone. Yes, there's a CFO budget piece, but there's also a communications piece, right? And there is also an implementation on the ground piece. Are your field staff, I mean, Ari or works around, he won't know if anything's happening unless his staff in the field also feel equally comfortable to tell him what's happening. So there is something that you can do at every level of the organization.
But I will say, I'm also on a nonprofit board myself, and I do what you're describing is a very common challenge, and I think the solution to that is the discussion internally about where we sit on the risk profile. And then from that comes, well, why? And then that discrepancy that you have relative to size of organization, because I think also in this is, you're bringing your past with you when you come from a large organization, and the risk profile of perhaps stability into the smaller organization, and it's probably the fundamental driver of the way that you just make decisions. And that's part of the communication, to make sure that when you're identifying staff, that there's a clarity about what kind of organization it is and how small, the risk, when it's small, the risks, they need to be managed very carefully.
Am I on?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hi, Robert Ferry with Housing Industry Foundation. So my question is to the funders. How open are you to that transparent conversation if there's an issue, something that's sort of blocking your way to get to the goal that you've identified in your funding? And would it rather be in the form of, hey, here's the issue, here's how we think we can solve it, i.e. we need a little bit more funding, or would you be as open to a problem-solving conversation?
I think I'll tackle that one, because I think Maya's been pretty explicit about where their funding goes to this exact issue. And I think, and I was speaking during the scenario planning about certain things that are pretty common with a funder-grantee relationship. When applicants come to you and say, we're able to meet 100% of these outcomes, there's no risk, everything is, we've perfected the model, and there is a bit of skepticism about that. And I think when an applicant comes to you instead and says, this is what we have planned, here are some potential things that can go wrong, this is what we think we can do about those things that might go wrong, and we'd love to keep in contact with you and iterate and get thought partnership around how to fix that. That is a very refreshing conversation. Knowing that there are restraints. Not every funder can always say, yes, I can provide that additional $50,000 or $100,000. But when you go into the relationship up front with some clear expectations that things can go wrong, and that both sides of the relationship are willing to have a candid conversation about that, you get the thought partnership and potentially the funding or connections to other funding. But if it feels like it's not open and there isn't that transparency, and you're being given sort of a very pretty marketing brochure instead of a relationship and a dialogue, then it prevents the thought partnership, and it prevents maybe the connection to other funders, because the trust is diminished.
Don't wait until something goes wrong.
Exactly.
If you don't know where your funder sits, ask them before something goes wrong. Ask them when you're applying. Ask them right after they say yes to the grant. By the way, what is your policy? Do you want to hear from us? When should we approach you if we're seeing challenges? Ask before something goes wrong. We do recognize that there is a fear, and unfortunately a well-placed fear, that just saying there's a problem will jeopardize future funding. That specifically is a really big documented fear of nonprofits in our research. And why should I asked this in the scenarios, Why should I risk telling my funder about a $10,000 problem when I'm applying for a $200,000 renewal grant? That is a reality. I think we can all think of really compelling arguments to that, but talking about that internally, and if you bring it up before there's a problem, now you're not putting that future funding in jeopardy, you're just following the procedures you already put in place.
So I want to, since we're out of time, I want to take just a quick 20-second piece of advice from the panel, and then we'll be here in case there are any additional questions you want to come up and ask. So if you could give one piece of advice to either your funders or other nonprofits about the best way to approach this and change the dialogue, what would you suggest? If I can start with you, Ari. Sorry.
Sure, thanks, Anne. So I would say that in our experience, sometimes the path that seems like the most cautious path is in fact the most dangerous one. So I think if we think about this, when we are not forward about risk, we face two dangers, big dangers. One danger is that things are going wrong and we are not seeing them because we are not looking, right? And so we all need to be, as implementers, rigorously measuring and looking and monitoring, as Maya pointed out, to find those problems. And the other danger is that we think that by taking fewer risks, we're on safer ground. But from an impact perspective, by not taking or tolerating any risk, we actually face a much greater danger that we fail to solve any of the problems that matter. And so I think there's an opportunity for us that I think both Sobrato and Open Road Alliance are calling us to in a beautiful way, which is to open ourselves to the possibility of taking more risks and to doing so in a more rigorous fashion and measuring in a more rigorous fashion.
Yeah, what's interesting about my experience with Samasource is that I joined the organization when it had come on the heels of a significant amount of funding wins. But what was clear upon arriving is that the commitments and the promises and the vision and the challenge of executing that was far in excess of a very likely path and the magnitude that we could get there, or it would take longer. And I think that's one of the traps of the dynamic with the funding, is that we overpromise. And I think the biggest challenge that we have in this community of philanthropy is being able to set realistic expectations and build trust over a period of time to get to those expectations. And I think to frame the conversations about building trust, we have to be transparent about the risk, but own the accountability as a nonprofit. How are we addressing it? That's very important. You can't just give bad news and lay it on the funders or foundation's lap. You have to take accountability for acknowledging the realistic scenarios and the contingencies, but just as importantly, how you're thinking about resolving them. And then that opens up a conversation that builds trust that you can build and accrete over time. And it lends to that potential for the funders to bring a policy of, for perhaps we need a more rapid contingency planning or disbursement mechanism. But I think the first part of this is to be very realistic about those risks that you see, of course evaluate within your organization, but address how you're going to solve them, right? How you think about them to give the confidence and the trust.
One last piece of advice, Maya.
Be brave. Just be brave.
Yeah.
It's scary. It's hard. And I'm going to be honest, if you go home to your organizations and you implement these policies, you're probably going to lose funding in the first iteration, because not all funders are enlightened. But to Ari's point, it's worth it in the long run. And you don't have to jump off the bridge. You can start by just jumping off the step. But have the conversation ask the question. Your organization will be more sustainable with long-term trusting relationships than one-off promises that you know you can't keep.
Thank you. With that, please join me in thanking our panel.